Are you listening? Damn. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And welcome into this game preview episode of the Damn Podcast here on the 24/7 Sports Podcast Network and powered by BeaverBlitz.com. I'm your host, Carter Bahns. I'm joined, as always, by BeaverBlitz.com publisher Angie Machado. And since it's a Thursday, here on September 8th, we're previewing Oregon State's next football opponent. And as we do on Thursdays, we have a guest with us, Jackson Moore of BarkBoard.com, the Fresno State affiliate on the 24/7 Sports Network, is with us. Down in California, Jackson, first of all, I got to know, how hot is it down there today, and how excited are you that it's not supposed to be in the hundreds on game day anymore?
Yeah, I just got home. It said 108 in my car. It's been 114 after practice this week, and for whatever reason, it's supposed to cool down on Saturday, and so kind of good and bad. The Red Wave is happy it won't be so hot, but the Bulldogs were hoping to have it be as hot as possible or the Beavers coming in. So it looks like it's going to be a pleasant night.
Yeah, and actually it's, as it stands right now, it's forecasted to be about 10 degrees hotter in Corvallis than in Fresno on Saturday. So funny how that works out. I know it was well above 110 earlier in the week down there. But Oregon State throughout the week was practicing in Corvallis where it was, 80s-ish, sunny. So I think they'll be good to go for an evening kickoff down there in the Central Valley around 90 degrees. But with Jackson here with us today on Thursday, we're just going to hit all sorts of stuff on Fresno State, preview some of the strengths and weaknesses of that team, some of the matchups to watch for. But we're going to get things started with a review of Fresno State's win over Cal Poly last week, 34-7. Before we do that, I want to bring Angie in here because she hasn't gotten a chance to talk yet. But Angie's holding it down with me up here in Oregon. We're staying home this week. Neither of us are traveling to California. But Angie, how excited are you for this matchup, which I think you and I both expect to be one of the more coin flippy type games of Oregon State's 2022 season?
Yeah, I mean, this is a big one. I can't emphasize that enough, how big this game is. Not only just for Oregon State's preseason, but this, you guys know that have been watching the damn podcast. I picked this as a loss preseason. So I picked only 2 losses in the whole season. It was Fresno State and Utah. So I think this is a big opportunity. Jake Haener is a great quarterback. I'm anxious to talk to Jackson though, because I was not as impressed with Fresno State's offensive line with the Cal Poly game. And then I was more impressed with Oregon State's front 7 than I expected to be. So I'm anxious to see this matchup, but this is a big one for Oregon State. Never won down in Fresno.
Yeah, 0-6 down in Fresno. And Jackson, I think you picked up there that tidbit that Angie picked 2 losses this season. So she is super high on the Beavs, got them going 10-2. Going into the year, I picked them to go 5-7. And we'll run.
No, you picked 7-5.
Sorry, 7-5. 7-5. I had the numbers right, but the order wrong. See, okay, so I'm under the weather this week. I've got a cold. If you're listening or watching us live on YouTube, you can probably hear I'm a little congested. I'm going to be pounding Gatorade as we go along. So yeah, I might not be as sharp as I
was like mom liked Carter. As you see, I do like my essential oils, and I made Carter stop by on his way home from practice yesterday and pick up a whole bunch of vitamins and voodoo oils, as my kids call them.
A little bit of a care package from Angie. But Jackson, here we'll kind of we'll transition here into Fresno State talk. But I want to let you introduce yourself to our listeners. They're very familiar with you at this point with how much you've helped us out in previewing some of Oregon State's opponents throughout the years. I think we started running our off-season opponent previews like 4 years ago, and you've been a mainstay for us there and then throughout game week. So tell the listeners a little bit more about yourself, where you're based, how long you've been covering Fresno State, and some of the other teams that you cover for the 24/7 Sports Network.
Yeah, so I also cover Cal and Stanford, so I've been helping out with those previews over the last couple of years. I cover San Jose State and Hawaii. Hawaii, of course, has crossed paths a couple of times in recent years too. But I'm based here in Fresno. It all started here in Fresno. I've been covering the team since 2010. I started interning for Scout.com that year, and I've been contributing one way or another ever since. So about 13 seasons covering the Bulldogs, and was born and raised here in Fresno and going to games way before that. So remember the early 2000 series between these two teams, and it's exciting to kind of bring it back here after quite a while.
Jackson's almost as long as I am.
Yeah, I'm sure Jackson's got more fond memories of those early 2000s games than Angie might. I don't have any recollection of them. I was still too young at that point, but I know Angie has some horror stories to tell from those early 2000s games, particularly 03, I think, right?
No, 01.
01. Okay.
Yeah, not fun.
Well, speaking of Fresno State, the Bulldogs are coming off of a 35-7 win over Cal Poly in week 1, taking care of business in that FCS matchup. And Jackson, I kind of want to get your thoughts here before we preview Oregon State's matchup against the Bulldogs of just how well that team played at home a week ago against that FCS opponent. I know obviously you always expect an FBS team to take care of business, but 35-7 is, that's a solid score against an FCS team.
Yeah, so the Bulldogs came out as good as you could anticipate. They had a 21-0 lead in the first quarter, scored on the first 3 drives, and the remaining 45 minutes were kind of painful to watch. It was pretty even from there. This is the same Cal Poly team that the Bulldogs beat 63-10 last year. A few circumstances, Cal Poly is not coming off of a whole COVID year absence, and they're year 2 in their scheme. So thought they'd be a little more competitive, but I felt like more it was on Fresno State where they kind of stepped off the gas. They had some interesting substitution patterns where every possession basically was a different O-line group. In a lot of ways, it felt like kind of a scrimmage almost, and kind of competing on the field on a Thursday to see who might get those starts in week 2. So, the first quarter was great. The rest of the game didn't leave the Red Wave all that inspired, especially after all the hype that's been on this team all preseason and offseason.
Yeah, it's always tougher to get a good read on a team when they open the season against a school like Cal Poly, whereas Oregon State obviously opened up against one of the Mountain West favorites in Boise State. And I think you can glean a little bit more from that performance than Fresno State playing against Cal Poly. So that makes this week's matchup all the more interesting in that I don't think Oregon State probably saw all of what Fresno State wants to bring at it when it was watching the film. The Bulldogs probably didn't, unravel the playbook or throw all of their different blitz packages out there for Oregon State to see. So that's kind of an interesting wrinkle in this game where Oregon State was meanwhile running trick plays offensively, throwing all sorts of pressure at Hank Bachmeier and Talon Green. So a little bit more on film there for for Fresno State to watch. But you mentioned the offensive line, and we're going to talk strengths and weaknesses here. But since you mentioned it, I'll use it as a segue to the weakness, which you mentioned in our Behind Enemy Lines feature this week when we had you on to write a little breakdown and preview for us, that the offensive line is probably the weakness of this team. I'm curious, one, why that is, why you think that is, and two, how much of a problem could that be for Fresno State against an Oregon State team that looks a lot improved on its defensive front seven?
Part of it has to do with the fact that they're so well equipped at quarterback with Jake Haener, and their receiver group is just, about as talented, as deep as it's been at Fresno State in a long time. They've also got preseason All Mountain West running back. And so even if you just had an average O-line, it's going to look poor compared to the rest of your team. But it's more alarming when, Jake Haener is getting pressured and he's on the turf. And usually when there's a turnover by Haener, it seems to be when he's under pressure or is forced to make a play that he wouldn't have to if he had a little bit of a better O-line. So that was kind of the storyline last year as well. The running game was kind of a struggle. They got so far to one side of the spectrum of Haener tossing the ball around that they kind of had to refocus on the running game. There was one game they had a bye week, and they just said, we're gonna run it. And I don't think Haener even had 100 yards when they beat Wyoming. They were that focused on emphasizing the run. So with Coach Tedford, they're trying to be more physical and balanced, and the O-line's kind of the key if they can do that or not. They lose one tackle who went to the NFL as an undrafted free agent, just missed the roster the other day. They've got a preseason all-conference tackle, Dante Bullback, who is not one of the favorites on our site on the message boards. So it's kind of like, okay, you're preseason all-conference, but the locals know that there's some issues there with sealing the edge. And there's a big hole at one of the guard positions where they've been cycling 3 guys in and out, and they rotated a lot against Cal Poly. So just kind of average to some worrisome moments from the O-line, but not an overall just disastrous unit by any means either.
How about go ahead.
Go ahead, Angie.
Well, I just wanted to, all the talk when you talk to Fresno State insiders and you see the fans, it's all offense. And Jalen Cropper, I remember when Oregon State recruited him, super talented wide receiver, but we don't hear anything about the defense. What are your thoughts on the defense? Is that a strength, weakness? Where does the defense lie?
Yeah, that's exactly right. The strength and the weakness probably of this team are both on the same side of the ball. Okay. And defensively, a lot of the players are back. They didn't have a whole lot of personnel overhaul, but the coaching staff is almost brand new on that side of the ball. With Coach Tedford coming back, there's a lot of continuity, but a brand new defensive coordinator and 3 new defensive coaches. And again, how much did they show against Cal Poly? So you feel like on paper and with who those coaches are, Kevin Coyle, the DC, was the defensive coordinator for the Miami Dolphins for 4 years, was in the NFL for 2 decades after he was previously the defensive coordinator at Fresno State. The other assistants are mostly guys that were Bulldogs that had stops in the NFL or in the Power 5 and came back to coach for Coach Tedford. So everything on paper would point to the defense being solid, at least, and not a concern. But, they weren't over the top great last year either, though. You look at just about every position. There's not a big weakness. Just probably the biggest concern is that defensive tackle where a true freshman is starting, which is odd, especially over here where it's tough to recruit those types of players in the Mountain West. That's kind of the one question mark, perhaps, that doesn't have either a returning player that's started or a transfer that's came in to fill in a gap.
It's interesting because I think Oregon State fans look at Fresno State as somewhat of an easier matchup for the Oregon State offense after going up against Boise State, who, brought back a lot of players from a defense that led the Mountain West in scoring last year. I think they gave up 19 points a game or something like that. Boise State was loading the box against the Beavers and really trying to take away the run, which of course has been Oregon State's biggest strength for the last few years. So I think Oregon State fans are looking at this game and saying, oh, we should be able to put up way more than the 34 points against Fresno State than we did against Boise State because they're not as good of a defense. But yet when I look at, and we haven't run the BeaverBlitz staff picks yet. That'll be tomorrow for the listeners. You have an incentive to get to BeaverBlitz.com tomorrow. But when I look at the predictions that the 3 of us made, none of us picked Oregon State to score more than 31. So I'm curious, and I can't even pinpoint it in my own prediction why, we think Oregon State's going to have a tougher time moving the ball against Fresno. So I'm curious, Jackson, if Oregon State is to struggle and isn't able to move the ball like it did against Boise State to the tune of 34 points last week, why do you think that would be?
Yeah, I would say that it's a balanced defense where if they're able to compete at the line of scrimmage and not let Oregon State's running game going, they've got enough talent on the back end too, where they bring back 2 starting corners and they added another, Cam Lockridge from Hawaii, who was a starter there for 2 years. They've got their 2 starting safeties, one of which was supplanted by another returner. They've got 6 guys in the secondary that are going to be in and out. Again, it's hard to really pinpoint a particular strength or weakness with that defense, but even last year, as much as the offense was credited for everything, pretty much all the losses were the offense shooting themselves in the foot. They had 6 turnovers against Hawaii. They really had a tough time blocking Oregon when they went up there to face the Ducks, and the Boise State game was just a disaster overall. So looking at this defense, it's just if they can make Oregon State one-dimensional in one way or the other, that's basically how Tedford's defenses had success the first time around. That's what they're going to try to do. And It's kind of key in on whatever one dimension that ends up being during the game. It's kind of tough to tell with Oregon State. I'm not sure which way that's going to have to go with a new running back or with the passing game with Chance Nolan. I'm not sure which way they're going to try to push him.
When I hear that, what I hear is it's a defense that's not going to win the Bulldogs a bunch of games, but it's probably not going to cost them very many games. And I think when you pair that with an offense that, has one of the most potent passing attacks in the country, having a defense it's just rock solid and isn't going to do anything spectacular, but it's not going to cost you a game. That's a combination that I think is going to go pretty well for Fresno State. And of course it did last year with the Bulldogs winning 10 games, right? They went 10-3 last year, I think 10-2.
Yeah. 10-3.
Yeah. One more note on the offense before we move on to some bigger picture stuff. I'll let Angie take this one. I think it's kind of the softball, and we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about Jake Haener, who comes back for sixth, seventh year at this point. I mean, Jonathan Smith recruited him to Washington. That's how old this kid is. Angie, let's hear your thoughts on Jake Haener and pass it off to Jackson too.
Yeah, Jake Haener. I mean, I remember him when he was being recruited. How do you think that Jake Haener? I mean, I love this matchup because I like I said earlier, I think Fresno State's off. Their passing game is their strength, whereas Oregon State secondary is a strength. How do you think Fresno State's going to fare against Oregon State's very veteran defensive back group?
Yeah, I think we've got Haener and Marino Cropper, who were both preseason fourth-team All-Americans by various outlets. I mean, you've got other receivers. Nico Remigio in his first game at 100-plus yards last week. You've got Josh Kelly, who was 700-plus yards last year, I believe. I mean, Ty Jones from Washington. This is a tough offense to stop, and I think Oregon State's got the talent to slow it down. And then kind of what other factors turn this game from that point, if that's the case. For me, I think it comes down to the running game. If Fresno State can run the ball, I think they're going to have a much easier time moving it through the air. If they can't run the ball and Oregon State can drop back or put in pressures and have a little fun just focusing on the passing game, that's when Haener is at his worst, which is a slim part of his time at Fresno State. But he has had games where he's thrown picks and kind of cost the Bulldogs, or if he's getting sacked. So for me, it's less about, I think, Fresno State's receivers versus Oregon State's DBs, but more about, can the Bulldogs be balanced, and can the Beavers just prepare for the passing game, or do they have to stop everything?
One of those other factors that could help determine the outcome of this game, you brought that up, I think, is the atmosphere. Oregon State last year went 1-6 away from Reser Stadium. In true road games, it was 1-5, the only win coming against USC in the Coliseum. So, Oregon State has a ton to prove on the road this year. And if it is going to take that next step and compete for the Pac-12 title like it hopes to, these are the kinds of games that it's going to need to show that it's able to win. But we talked about the weather when we first came on. That's not going to create as hostile of an environment as it could have if this heat wave had gone into the weekend like it was originally forecasted to. But outside of that, Valley Children's Stadium is known to be a very hostile environment. It has one of the largest capacities, I think, of any Mountain West stadium. So I'm curious, from your perspective, from somebody who has been in that stadium on game days countless times and who will be there on Saturday, what that atmosphere is like when a Pac-12 team like Oregon State comes in. What are you expecting in that way this weekend?
Yeah, typically when Power 5 teams come here, it's a big deal, not just in general, but still from the Pat Hill years, where that's kind of a measuring stick for Fresno State if they want to beat the BCS or the Power 5 types of schools. And this is one of those rare opportunities to get them at home. This is the first Pac-12 opponent at home since 2015. They don't have another Power 5 school coming to Fresno until 2027. So there's a lot for Fresno State fans to be excited about for this game. I'm also curious on the other side too, because frankly, the whole offseason, Fresno State's had a date circled on its calendar, and it's been September 17th instead of the 10th, because next week they're going to USC, and they usually travel 15,000 deep or so to games in LA. And of course, with all the hype on the Trojans, that's kind of been the big one. And maybe some fans have overlooked Oregon State a little bit. So I'll be curious to see how the the atmosphere comes out. And then you couple that with last year, they had their first sellout in about 6 years, and they just totally laid an egg against Boise State. There was altercations in the crowd. It was just an ugly night all around. And so will there be more of the same this time around, or will it be a little bit of a redemption for Valley Children's Stadium? Anxious to see.
Well, that's my question, because I was down in 01, and granted, that was a bit of a buzzsaw. That was coming off of Oregon State's trouncing of Notre Dame in the Fiesta Bowl, finishing 4 in the country. Sports Illustrated turns around, puts them number 1 preseason. Oregon State opens the season in Fresno. David Carr had like the game of his life. And that was seriously, if you're a Fresno State fan, I'm sure it was amazing. But for an Oregon State fan, it was frankly scary. I mean, batteries, bottles, things being thrown. Oregon State then went back in 03 and then said they would never go back to Fresno State. Fast forward, 19 years, they're back on the road. Is this a different environment, or should Oregon State fans? I know a lot of Oregon State fans said they would not go. So is this something for the fans that are going? Is it going to be a different safety level, or is it still going to be as raucous as it was maybe back in the early 2000s?
Yeah, I would say, not too long after those types of events, even June Jones claimed he had a screwdriver thrown at him. We don't know if that's accurate, but there was apparently a screwdriver in the grass.
Okay.
What he said. So they got rid of alcohol at the Fresno State games for quite a while, and that changed the atmosphere quite dramatically. There was also, frankly, a long stretch where they didn't have a whole lot of high stakes games. So there haven't been a whole lot of big crowds for a while to that level. They usually do over 30,000, but recently alcohol has been brought back. It's about a halftime type of deal. And there hasn't been a whole lot of ruckus at these games for a long time, but when there was the Boise State sellout last year, you've got like an extra 10,000 people that you usually don't have in that stadium that brought a little bit of a different.
But that's your big rival too. I mean, that's like Oregon coming to Oregon State. I mean, that's a big one.
Right. And so there was some altercations. There was a fight that spilled onto the field. And so, that was as Fresno State was getting the doors blown off of them. The Broncos. I would hope that was an isolated incident and that security will be ramped up a little bit. But yeah, I would say most Saturdays have been pretty calm. But when you sell out, you just don't quite know what kind of.
Oh yeah, and a 7:30 game. I mean, Oregon State's not. It's not like Oregon State's immune to jackass fans. I mean, it just happens. I mean, everywhere you go, especially when it's a 7:30, you've been tailgating all day. I was just curious because it was an eye opener, because I've never been to a place where glass bottles are being thrown on the field, and I actually was sitting right behind. Dennis Erickson was the coach, so Erickson's family was right in front of us, and right across the aisle was Fresno fans, and thank goodness they didn't know that we were all Oregon State fans there, because it would have been probably ugly. But no, just an interesting thing. But no, I think I love the matchup. I love playing the best Mountain West teams, because I think when you take the kind of the top Mountain West schools, I think they fit really nicely with the whole kind of middle of the pack. I think it's a great matchup.
And we saw that come to fruition last year with, the Pac-12 really struggling against the Mountain West. Of course, Oregon State fell to Utah State in the LA Bowl at the end of last year, redeemed itself in week 1 this year against Boise State. But again, to Angie's point, it's a tough matchup on the road against a team that was picked to win its division in the Mountain West. And so, Jackson, I'm curious, as we move into some bigger picture stuff here, with the Bulldogs being picked to win the West, how realistic of an expectation is that from this team, considering the success it just had a year ago and how much talent comes back?
Yeah, I think that's pretty much the floor for Fresno State's expectations here. San Diego State is usually a tough one. The Bulldogs, it seems like every time Fresno State has a good team, they beat the Aztecs. And when there's a bad Fresno State team, they get blown out by San Diego State.
That's the litmus test.
Right. And so the Bulldogs have kind of circled that one as a win. And especially with San Diego State losing to Arizona by a pretty significant amount, that one feels even more so to be the case this year. The rest of the West is not very good. San Jose State barely beat Portland State. UNLV might be a sneaky contender, but Nevada got decimated with the transfer portal. So did Hawaii. is off to a really bad start. So the road is quite easy for the Bulldogs, I would say, from a divisional standpoint. And I mean, they could very realistically be favored their last 9 games after they get through Oregon State and USC, regardless of if they're 1-2 or 3-0. The schedule is very favorable from there. So the bottom line is for them to get into that Mountain West Championship game and then try to get their first title since 2018. But if they can be nationally relevant, kind of see how the rest of the Group of 5 champions fare, and maybe they'll have a shot at that New Year's Six Bowl. That's kind of been the golden ticket Fresno State's been trying to aim for decades now, and this seems to be one of those years where that's potentially in play if they can get one of these big wins early.
But Fresno State is a lot like Oregon State, because Oregon State, doesn't start with a bunch of cupcakes. They have Boise State, Fresno State out the gate. Then they do a Montana State, and then it's USC and Utah. So, really front load it with some really tough teams. Let's talk Tedford a little bit, though. Big picture. What is it about Fresno that these guys come back? I mean, it's kind of Oregon. It's kind of Corvallis like in a way, because, Mike Riley's come back. What was it that made Tedford come back?
Yeah, I think a big part of it is the guys that come through Fresno State and they really want to see it successful. I mean, in 2016, Fresno State went 1-11, and it was the worst I've ever seen Fresno State look. The DeRuyter era, an outsider, quote unquote, just, it really did not work out well at the end of his tenure. And so Tedford, as much as he wanted to coach again, the tagline was restore the pride and tradition of Fresno State football. He brought in a lot of Fresno State guys. He cleaned house of the entire staff that was there before, even some other Fresno State guys that were there to try to kind of float the ship for a little bit. And and then you look at his staff, he's got 3 or 4 former Bulldogs on it as well. Fresno's kind of a unique place in California, and it's kind of tough if you're not familiar with the program previously to get it. And that's what worked with Kalen DeBoer. He was there, got his trial run as a coordinator. He had all the lay of the land by the time he came back, and they weren't going to try to hire anyone else that was outside again for quite some time after the DeRuyter experiment.
It's kind of
like Angie's point,
right? I mean,
yeah, I love your point, Angie, about how that is very Oregon State-esque, because look at the coaches who have had success in Corvallis recently. It's Mike Riley coming back for a second stint, and obviously he knew the program from coaching for a couple of years to close out the 90s. It's Jonathan Smith coming back after winning as a player and having success as a coach. So,
and then bringing back, Trent Bray now is the D coordinator, and Jake Cookus. And Corvallis it's more of a rural. It's kind of a Fresno State. It's that rural, kind of town. I don't know. Farming area. Out in the quote unquote middle of nowhere. You've got this college town, and I think both programs, we're seeing over the last couple of years, are on the rise under the leadership of some of their alumni. Excuse me, Jackson. Before we let you go, we got to get a prediction out of you. And for the BeaverBlitz readers who haven't read Behind Enemy Lines today, be sure to do that. There's much more than just Jackson's score prediction there. But before we let you go, Oregon State at Fresno State, 7:30 on CBS Sports Network. What you got?
Yeah, I picked Fresno State 28, Oregon State 24 in my preview, which wasn't too much different than the nearest Carter, from my understanding. I think for Fresno State, a lot of times in these very even-looking Power 5 matchups, they got to go on the road. They start off slow. There's that big play that has the momentum turn, and the opposing crowd. It's just something that they're not used to seeing in the Mountain West, and kind of all those little things add up, and they fall just short. And you look back at all the little plays they could have made to win. Even at Oregon last year, they were counting those 2 or 3 plays that could have swung the game their way, or the slow start. And now finally they're at home. They have momentum. They've got a sellout crowd, it looks like. I just feel like they're not going to have those hiccups that prevent them from getting the win. But I do think it's going to be very close. I don't think it's going to be decided till well late into the fourth quarter. I think it's going to be a lot more physical than kind of the over-under. I think it's above 60 right now, and we both 61. Had our scores quite a bit lower. I think Oregon State's very physical. I think Fresno State, while known for being physical last year. That's what Tedford wants to be, and it's going to be a very even physical game where a big play here or a turnover there kind of makes the difference.
Yeah, at the end of the day, whoever wins this game, I don't think it's going to be by more than a field goal or a touchdown. I don't see this thing getting out of hand one way or another. I don't see it being decided by more than one score. But Jackson, we want to thank you again so much for coming on for a half hour here and just letting us kind of pick your brain on Fresno State, because Angie and I, we're so oriented on the Pac-12 that we try to follow, the West Coast football, Mountain West. But we obviously do not have the wealth of knowledge that you do, being down in Fresno and being on campus every day. So thanks for joining us and for giving our listeners all sorts of insight into that Bulldog program.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me, and I'll see y'all again, Cal and Stanford week.
Yes.
Yep. We'll do it again. The listeners are going to become very familiar with you, Jackson.
All right. Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
Yep. Thanks for stopping by. That is Jackson Moore of 24/7 Sports, barkboard.com. Angie is still with me here, and we're going to talk about the week that was in Corvallis. We're going to provide a couple of keys to the game, but first, Angie, we got to talk about the weekend that was at BeaverBlitz.com, because we set a new record for subscriptions. The promo has ended. The 75% off promo has ended. But for those of you who are listening who just joined BeaverBlitz.com, we want to give you a huge welcome to the community, and thank you for joining us and being here for the ride as Oregon State goes through this 2022 season with us.
It's going to be fun. And yes, I was giving Carter updates through the promo. So thank you for that. Great to see all the excitement with Oregon State.
BeaverBlitz.com is the place to be as the season continues. If you haven't been there all week, you're missing out on all sorts of great content. If you have been, we'd love to continue to hear your feedback, help spread the word. The community is growing faster than ever before. And a lot of that, I think we can thank Oregon State's play
football team,
on the field. But it's good to see that the fan base is so engaged. As we hop in here to the second half of the show, Angie, it wasn't really a newsworthy week in Corvallis. And, I was down there, talked to some offensive players and coaches, some defensive guys. Jonathan Smith, of course, had his press conference on Monday. We didn't really learn anything new, but we got a lot of really good reaction to how the team played on Saturday. Yeah,
I think, and that's I think that's what the coaches want. They don't want bulletin board material. They don't want guys getting too high after a win. So I think if you're a fan, that shows it's a very veteran team in that regard, because you don't have the emotional. They're very businesslike. But this is a team, like we've said, there's a different feel to this team. And I'm anxious to see how they react and bounce this next week on Saturday at Fresno.
There are some areas where no news is good news. And one of those is on the injury front, where Oregon State came out of week one healthy. And this just continues to be the theme. And again, we knock on wood every time we say this, but Oregon State came out of fall camp very healthy. It came out of week one very healthy. And I think if Oregon State is going to reach its ceiling this year, health is a big element of that. And Oregon State, as we know, has built all sorts of depth at key positions, but keeping those top, those high-end guys healthy is always going to be important for a program like Oregon State that doesn't necessarily have the 4 and 5 star depth up and down its roster. But to that injury end, since there are no new updates, the only two players that we know for sure will be out this week for the Fresno State game are outside linebacker Ryan Frankie and defensive lineman Sione Lolohea. Angie,
Frankie's out for the year, but Lolohea, is he still day to day, right? Or week to week?
He's more week to week.
Yeah.
Jonathan Smith, before week one, said it could be a couple of weeks before he comes back. So if I had to put a timeline on it, if I had to estimate, I'd say that USC Utah game would be kind of the front end of when we might see Lolohea out. And I think we haven't gotten confirmation from Smith on Alton Julian, but I think if you and I were to project that, and again, this is not an exact science. Alton Julian, I think it would make sense to see him come in for that USC game.
Yeah. I mean, because ACLs are usually a full year, and we're not at a full year yet. He has been practicing some. I think you hold him out and let him make an appearance, maybe that USC game. That's best guess. And watch, they'll put him out. He'll come out, Fresno, who knows?
We'll see. It would only add all sorts of depth and talent to Oregon State's already loaded safety room and that defensive backfield as a whole. So without really the, any newsworthy stuff on Monday, Jonathan Smith was mostly asked about Fresno State. It was interesting to get his perspective on playing down there and coaching down there. Because of course, as a player, he's been down there with the Beavers. He coached there when he was with Idaho. Of course, he spent a couple of years at Boise State and played down there at Fresno. What he said was, we've just gotten beat. Every time it seems like every time Jonathan Smith goes down there, he's on the losing end. And I think there are very few people in the Valley Football Center that are more hungry to kind of right that trend than Jonathan himself.
Yeah, and this is such a hard one. I mean, we're not talking predictions yet, but that's just it. I mean, Oregon, this is a tough place to play. It's a really good team, and it's on the road, and Oregon State has struggled on the road. So there's a lot of questions. But then again, I looked at how many things they, last year winning at USC, hadn't done that since 62. So, I mean, stranger things have happened, but it is not going to be an easy task.
And I think you and I both kind of factored that into our predictions. Again, I keep teasing this, but it really is a great way to prep for the game at BeaverBlitz.com. Every Friday, we run our staff picks. And this week, we'll actually have an updated leaderboard because we have 1 week of action behind us.
Who's the leader right now?
I think there's like a 5 or 6 way tie. A lot of us picked Oregon State last week, so
I know, but what about the the?
Oh, that's right. That's right. Yeah, we do have a tiebreaker. I actually haven't calculated it yet, and in fact, as soon as we get off of here, I'm gonna update the leaderboard and format our picks for this week. But
I actually think I'm right up there, which we might need to take a picture because I'm never up there.
Most likely, I think you actually might have picked the exact score. You might have been. You were at least very close to it, but
it's close.
We've both factored in the fact that Oregon State's going into a really hostile environment that it hasn't won in before into our prediction. And I think that's why Angie and I are both, even after the way Oregon State played last week, I think we're still a little bit concerned about the Beavers' chances of winning down there because of the history of, the fact that this is going to be a sellout. Like Jackson mentioned, it gets really loud and rowdy in there when a Pac-12 team comes in. And they're hungry to play one of those games. So I think the environment factor of this game is as big as any of the matchups on the field.
I picked this as a lost preseason when we went through the picks. But now that I've seen, and I get what he said about, the offensive line subbing in, but I just saw so much pressure being brought by Cal Poly that we'll get to keys of the game. But I think this is either going to be really close and the Beavers lose, or I think it's going to be a blowout and Oregon State cruises to a victory. How's that for the spectrum?
Yeah, there you go. It's either going to be close or not. You heard it here first. Yeah, that's top tier analysis right there. Some of the other interviews that we conducted throughout the week down in Corvallis, talking to some of the two coordinators and then a couple of players from each side of the ball. We were, in addition to getting their perspective on Fresno State this week, it was a good opportunity to kind of recap what happened in week 1. And I think you learn so much about a team after its first game. And I think Oregon State did a lot of that. And I think, to be fair, they went into that game expecting to win by a couple of scores, but the way they did it surprised a lot of Oregon State fans. And they probably didn't even see this coming themselves. The 5 turnovers defensively that's just an eye-popping stat, and of course was one of the big takeaways this week talking to all of those players and coaches was that they did a great job getting pressure on Hank Bachmeier and Taylon Green, forcing them into errant throws, and then of course being there to take advantage of that. That was one of the takeaways that stood out to me this week. On top of that, of course, the offensive side of the ball struggled with penalties on Saturday. It had 10 penalties for 100 yards. Chance Nolan had a couple of interceptions. Deshaun Fenwick fumbled. So the turnovers and penalties are kind of the area of not necessarily concern, but kind of the point of emphasis of, hey, we need to clean this up going into week 2, which I think we both expect, right, Angie? I mean, after
absolutely.
week 1, seeing some of that kind of just naturally work itself out with some of those the penalties and turnovers.
Yeah, and I think if you're the coaches, you're pretty much ecstatic that that's what you need to work on. That you didn't see a team just come out and completely just look lost. That they knew the offense, they knew the defense, they knew what they were doing, and it was really just procedural stuff. That you hate to see it. Thanks, Connor.
I just saw that comment come in the YouTube chat.
I did. I got my hair chopped the other day. So no, you want to see. I mean, you want to see things that are fixable, and those are those teachable things that the staff can go back, film, and say, hey, this is what you need to do, or this is how you block, or this is where. And I think it's a big, huge improvement that we see on those issues in week 2.
Procedural penalties, I think, are one of the easier areas to clean up. All you have to do is just drive it home, make them do push-ups after, whatever, and just drive home that point. And a lot of that is just so mental. Obviously, you don't want to think too hard about it. Oftentimes that will create a bigger problem. But I do think that is one of the areas that naturally in the game of football, you see cleaned up from week 1 to week 2. So I'm not terribly concerned about it. And to your point, Angie, that is, if that is the main thing that Oregon State needs to clean up, that's a great sign, because that means everything tactically, game plan wise, conditioning wise, everything else was right there where it needed to be.
Yeah. And, my other big piece that I'm going to look at, and this is a little tougher, but I want to see more consistency from those receivers. And I feel like I'm kind of beating that same drum every single week. And I know you feel the same way, but too many drops from some of the starters there that we need to see some consistency and make those catches, because I think the quarterback has made the step up. We saw some great passes. We saw some great deep balls, but now we need those receivers to be consistent and catch those balls.
Yeah. It's an area that, I think if teams are going to stack the box like Boise State did last week, Oregon State has to continue to take advantage of it. And Chance Nolan showing his improvement there is only one half of it, because there were times where he did put the ball on the money and it was dropped. One of those turned into an interception. The other one should have been a touchdown. So yeah, it's, there's more than one element to that. That's a good segue kind of to our keys to the game. I've again, on our rundown here, I listed one offensive and one defensive, but I haven't consulted with Angie to get her keys. So she might have something on top of what I've got. She might have something that contradicts what I have, or she might just agree with it. But my offensive key to the game for Oregon State this week is just to establish the running game, because to the point I just made, Boise State stacked the box, sent 8 or 9 hats to the ball on every play, and the Beavers weren't really able to run the ball. And so Oregon State had to rely on its passing game. Luckily it was there, but if it's not, Oregon State can't afford to be one-dimensional. No. And I think last year at times that's what cost them in games, was when the running game wasn't there, it wasn't able to capitalize through the air.
Yeah, absolutely. I 100% agree with you on that. Plus, on the road, you always want to be able to control the clock and the time of possession. So running the game and getting that established early, because if you can get that running game established, then it also opens up the passing game and just makes life easier. Coach Lincoln would be able to open up his playbook and do what he wants to do. So absolutely 100%. But like I said, I need to see consistency from those wide receivers, and I will call them out on it.
I've seen a couple of plays from this game, and actually at BeaverBlitz.com, Peter Riley Osborne does incredible job with his trench report. And this week, kind of broke down the film a little bit and provided some insight, not only to the offensive line, but just kind of the way some of these plays are designed, why they're called, why they work. And one of the things that stood out in watching his film study there was it totally was clear that Boise State had like upwards of 8 or 9 guys running to the ball and assuming and hoping that it's going to be a run play. And I think you can really clearly see that when you watch the game back, which I found really interesting. I mean, you just looking at where the defenders' eyes are, you can tell that, the safeties, the linebackers, everybody in the middle of the field is keyed in on the run. And so I think that's why it's so big for Oregon State to be able to capitalize when that is the case, because you have one-on-one situations downfield with your receivers. And so I have to give a lot of credit to guys like Tyjon Lindsey and Luke Musgrave for identifying that and taking advantage of that last week.
Absolutely. And that, like I said, if you're not a member of BeaverBlitz, you need to join, just for nothing else than for Peter's analysis on the trench reports, because seriously, it's a 15-minute breakdown, and he takes plays, breaks them down. And, you always say hat for a hat, you want a hat for a hat. But when he's able to slow down the film, stop it, and point out who has who and where the plays are going, it will make you a smarter football player. Believe me.
A smarter fan as well. I
guess not a football player. Sorry.
Yeah.
A football fan.
Oregon State establishing the running game. Angie and I both agree. Offensively, that's the key to the Beavers scoring points this week. It's to force Fresno State to respect both elements and to not just key in on one side, because, again, you're playing a dangerous game if you're getting one-dimensional. You better be really good in that one dimension. Otherwise, you're going to run into some problems. Defensively, Angie, I'll let you go first here if you've got something other than me.
No, because I just took a peek, and it is exact same, because I think your point and my point are exactly the same. Sorry. They have to pressure Haener. I mean, Haener's a top tier quarterback. What I saw from the O-line at Fresno, I'm not super impressed with. And I think what I saw from the defensive front from what I saw from the offensive line of Fresno State, I was not impressed with last week. And what I saw from Oregon State's front seven, I was more impressed with. This could be big. I mean, if Oregon State can get pressure on Haener and force him into either quick decisions or bad decisions, my loss prediction is totally out the window, because it's that important.
That's the matchup that I'm going to be watching the most this week, is just, can Oregon State really key in and take advantage of a position group that, as Jackson just said when he was breaking down the Bulldogs, is the weakness of this team, that offensive line.
Yeah.
And I think in years past, we'd look at that and say, okay, well, Oregon State's defensive front is the weakness of its team, so it should be able to, the fact that an opponent's offensive line, the fact that it's not good, that kind of mitigates the damage of what you could see from an Oregon State defensive front that's not playing well. And I'm doing a poor job of explaining this. Maybe it's my cold. But I think when you see those two weaknesses go up against each other, you say, okay, well, our concerns on Oregon State's defensive front are mitigated because they don't have a tough matchup. Well, this year, we think, and the team thinks, and we saw in week one, that Oregon State does have a stronger defensive line, and that its outside linebackers are getting pressure on the quarterback, and then they are containing the run. And so the fact that they've done that against an offensive line at Boise State that I think was, thought by many to be, if not good, certainly better than it was last year. The fact that we've seen that makes me pretty optimistic that Oregon State can get some pressure this week.
Yeah, that's, like I said, the matchup with Fresno's wide receivers and Oregon State CBs, I think, is intriguing too. But the biggest thing I'm looking for is if Oregon State can get pressure early on Haener, I think it's going to be big.
Yeah, because, I mean, look at the defensive backs. Like, they have a tough matchup, don't get me wrong, but I think we're both very confident in their ability to not necessarily stop the passing attack, but to slow it down.
Yeah.
But the key for so long has been that they didn't get enough help from the front seven to really show what they're capable of. And so if they do get that help this week, I think that's the only way Oregon State slows Fresno State down to an extent great enough that it wins this game.
Clay Carter, this is not on the rundown. I'm just curious. Oregon State had 5 turnovers last weekend against Boise State. Over, under. Do you think they go over or under that this week?
Oh, under. I just think, Jake Haener being the experienced guy that he is, and those receivers being as sure-handed as they are, you're not going to see, like last week against Boise State, where Taylon Green was just throwing the ball over the middle of the field, hoping his receiver would be there. You're not going to see Hank Bachmeier sit in the pocket for so long that he's getting strip sacked. I just think that Haener is so much I think tactically he's just so much more sound than either of those guys were last week. And, his high end ability as a passer, I think not only has the ability to mitigate what Oregon State's defense can do against him, but also, potentially elevate his play above what Oregon State's defense is capable of.
Solid.
Those are our keys to the game. Establish the running game offensively and pressure the pocket defensively. We still have 10 minutes left before we hit the hour mark. So I wanted to, every time we record a podcast, I say, all right, if we have enough time, we're going to get to this. And sure enough, I didn't do that this week. But I do have the Pac-12 schedule pulled up this week.
Okay.
And I think this is a good opportunity to look at some of the games that are coming up in the conference this week. Of course, Oregon State's game against Fresno State, I think, is one of the biggest matchups again for the Pac-12, as it was last week. Just for a middle of the road to, middle upper of the road Pac-12 team to go against a very good Mountain West team. As a conference, those are the games that you need to win. So Oregon State took care of business for the conference last week. Can it do it again this week? That's why I think it's such a big game.
Question here. Travis Pennington says, in your opinions, if the Beavers pull off this win, would they be next in line for be ranked top 25? Do you think this is enough, or do you think because Montana State's not going to do it?
No, Montana State won't do it. It's tough because I don't think Oregon State got the respect it deserved from the voters after week one. To only get 5 votes, and I think that puts Oregon State around 35th, 37th in the polls. I just think Oregon State's better than that.
I think it was the 7:30 game.
Week one, there's that element too, and I think there's also the element of why do we do preseason polls? It's just a tool for confirmation bias. I think if you're just ranking week one alone, Oregon State should be closer to the top 25 than that 35 to 40 range. So I don't know that a win this week is enough. It probably puts them right on the edge. Maybe they take Oregon's spot as the first team out. But yeah, I think they'd be deserving of a top 25 spot. I just don't know that they would get it.
I think it's another 7:30 game, and that's I think the problem with. I even looked at our 24/7 analysis afterward, and they didn't have them in the top 25, for the week. And I think a lot of it's just that nobody watched it, and on the East Coast, they just didn't stay up late and they didn't watch. I think it'll be close. If Oregon State can beat Fresno convincingly, like by, let's say 14 to 21 points, then I think the voters would have to take a look.
I completely agree there. So now that I've got the Pac-12 schedule pulled up, let's just highlight. We can go down the list and you can stop me if there's a game you want to talk about here. Number 13 Utah hosts Southern Utah. That should be a blowout. Colorado goes on the road to Air Force.
Air Force will roll. That
triple option could spell danger for the Buffaloes in Colorado Springs.
Dude, the Buffaloes look bad.
Yeah. Bad. Number 19, Wisconsin hosts Washington State. Jake Dickard's squad barely pulled off a win against Idaho last week. They were down 10-0 at one point and struggled all the way through that, but did outscore the Vandals there on the Palouse. Washington hosts Portland State, another FCS matchup that, I think we expect to go in the favor of the Pac-12. Of course, Washington last year lost to Montana, so this is never a given, but I think we both expect the Huskies to win that one. Cal hosting UNLV. That one's a little more interesting to me.
Yeah, that one's, especially, you look at defensive coordinator for Beaver fans, defensive coordinator at UNLV is Keith Hayward, who used to be at Cal. So,
and of course used to be at Oregon as well. UCLA gets, I think this is Alabama State, the Yellow Jackets or the Wasps or whatever. Hey, I'm pretty good at knowing schools' mascots and, finding and like identifying these niche teams. I think it's the Alabama State Yellow Jackets, but maybe it's the Hornets. If somebody in the YouTube chat wants to comment there.
So what you're telling me, UCLA is going to roll. with 10 people in the stands.
It should with about, to your point, about 10 people in the stands there at the Rose Bowl. One of the tougher matchups for the Pac-12 this week, Arizona State goes on the road to Stillwater against number 11 Oklahoma State. That'll be a test, and I think it'll tell us a lot about where Arizona State's program is. If it goes in there and just gets blown out like I think it could, we could see the bottom fall out of this Sun Devils program. But on the other hand, Herm Edwards could go a long way in saving his job if he goes and pulls the upset.
Yeah.
The ABC game of the week, number 10 USC going on the road to Stanford, playing at the Farm in front of,
25.
I mean, if there were 10 at the Rose Bowl, we might be looking at about 8. In
No, but
Stanford.
USC's band has more than that.
That'll be a home game for USC.
Yes.
Stanford students, I don't even think are on campus yet, and that probably accounts for about 2,000 of their 4,000 fans. So, USC home game on the road at the Farm, 4:30 on ABC in prime time. Oregon hosts Eastern Washington, another FCS matchup. Kind of a trend in these early season games, of course. The Pacific Northwest FCS squads getting their paydays. Pretty comfy landing spot for Oregon. We're not going to know anything about them after this week unless they lose or struggle. Of course, Oregon State goes on the road to Fresno State at 7:30 p.m. on CBS Sports Network. And then Arizona gets the nightcap hosting Mississippi State at 8 p.m. on FS1. That's going to
be a good one.
After the way Arizona played last week, taking care of business on the road at San Diego State, man, I think this Wildcats team is so far improved.
Yes, that one will be an interesting one. I'll be changing stations at halftime to check that one out.
That's the beauty of covering Oregon State football games from home, as I think we're doing for maybe the first and last time this week. I'm planning on going to a couple of away games, but Angie and I both said Fresno. I think we'll watch that one from our couches. But that is all we've got for this episode of the Damn Podcast. Again, we're going a little shorter on this one. Didn't want to hold Jackson too long. He had just finished a radio or a TV hit before he came on. So wanted to get him off and,
I don't see how he does what he does.
Night.
Seriously, he covers Hawaii, San Jose State, Fresno State, Cal, and Stanford. 5
teams. It's impressive. I mean, I think about what we do at Oregon State and say, man, that's a lot, but 5 teams, man.
5 teams. Yeah.
It's exhausting to even think about. We want to thank everybody for joining us live on YouTube at BeaverBlitz Video. You guys are absolutely crushing the numbers right now.
We grew like 100 people yesterday on YouTube video or BeaverBlitz Video.
Yeah, it's impressive to see what you guys are helping us do on that platform. We just continue to grow. We continue to grow across the board. Of course, I mentioned BeaverBlitz.com is at a new record for subscriptions. So thanks to all of you guys who are listening, who joined us over the weekend, taking advantage of that promo. We're glad to have you on board. You're not going to be disappointed with the content you get throughout the season. So for more content like the Damn Podcast, head to BeaverBlitz.com. For more of that throughout the weekend, as we provide game coverage, go in depth afterwards with our He Said, She Said column, highlight some of the top performers from Oregon State versus Fresno State, and much more. And
join our Lodge chat. Road games we had a great time for a home game, but during the game, make sure you're checking the Lodge because we kind of discuss the game. And if you go back to try to read the Lodge chat, you're going to be disappointed because it's like all over the board. It's high, it's low, it's high, it's low, but it's super fun during the time. So
good advertisement there to get in the Lodge. We want to thank Jackson Moore for joining us on this preview episode. Thanks to everyone who joined us live on YouTube. And of course, thanks to everyone who's listening to us anytime on your favorite podcast app. You can find us there at Damn Podcast, an Oregon State Athletics podcast. We're going to be back on Sunday to recap Oregon State versus Fresno State. Until then, you can follow her on Twitter at Angie Machado 1. You can follow me at Carter Bahns, and we'll talk to you on Sunday for another episode of the Damn Podcast.